Hey, so we're starting. Welcome to two FMA nerds talking about stuff. Yeah, I'm Coach Kurt from the Elvis Cali Fight Team. I do a bunch of other stuff. Today I'm going to be joined by Jesse Santiago from FMA Pulse. He's a excellent videographer and content creator and phenomenal Filipino martial arts instructor as well. So we're gonna dive in and have some fun talking about some interesting things, particular to FMA and FMA content creation. Definitely tell us where you're from, drop questions and comments in the thing, share all the terrible marketing that I'm awful at. So enjoy this intro, then we'll get started here. And here we go. All right, let's do this. So, Guro Jesse, how's it going, man?
Good, good. And you? Just trying to still stay awake. I got back from the Midwest late last night, so
Yeah, that's a lot of travel. And I mean, for everybody, today is Guro Jesse's birthday. Wish the young man a happy birthday, and however which way you want to do that. But by the way, happy birthday, young man.
thank
So,
you.
yes, sir. So yeah, traveling. And we were talking a little bit about this before we got started. But how? I mean, you spend a lot of time on the road, and you spend a lot. I mean, we'll dive into who you are and what you do and who your daddy was and all that fun stuff. But you spend a lot of time on the road. Um, how is that for like the past 10 years?
I mean, it's weird. I've been traveling more now since after COVID. It
Yeah,
started in 2021. Just because with the whole lockdown, I needed to get out of Chicago at the time, and I have friends in Florida, and I'm like, I'm gonna go spend a month there
yep,
and cover the FMA scene as far as I can go. So I only covered Central and South Florida. I didn't make it up to North Florida because I was just burned out. I was like, wow, this is a long drive.
yeah, that is fair.
And then it just snowballed after that. It's weird because I've been traveling more now than before the pandemic. So
That's crazy because like coming out of the pandemic, I mean, the country was locked down, the world was locked down, and now I'm finding is like people a couple of years after this have really got it itching to them to like we've been locked down, let's go do stuff, and it's really cool to see that people are out doing stuff and going places more because I mean when we didn't have it, uh, you didn't realize how much you needed it, and yeah, it's really interesting just seeing like that change that change after COVID as to like the people's need to like get out and do stuff and have human interaction again. So yeah, have you experienced the same thing?
yeah, and also just with a few tragedies that happened in 2021, I came to the realization that I need to do this now while I'm still able to. I'm like, why am I going to work a 9 to 5 until I'm 65 when I'm all old and decrepit and I can barely move?
Yeah.
Might as well do this now because like you never know when your time is up.
Yep. Yep. I can definitely appreciate that because I mean the fact is, in the end of all this, what do we have other than our experiences? And I mean, in some of the cases, like if we just wait too long, it'll never happen. So we just got to go do stuff. Now, of course, if we don't have the finances, opportunity, and all that other stuff, that's to be expected. But I mean, if you have an opportunity to go do stuff, go do it. And that's what's really cool about like FMA after COVID, and especially in the digital landscape, is people have really connected and it's made an effort to like reach out and coordinate and communicate and say, hey, we were all separated because of circumstance. Now let's get together and hang out and do stuff. So and that's I observed that last year when I was down in Washington, and what I'm kind of gathering just from hearing from people, that's pretty much the same thing as that. Like they felt this need to like let's get together, let's play.
Yep.
So
And thing it too, like I had a whole backlog of videos that during lockdown, I'm like, oh, I actually have time to edit these videos and
yeah,
wrapped up a lot of stuff from the past that I wasn't able to get to.
Yeah.
Um, and then once things started, like once I started to finish all these video projects, I'm like, oh man, I'm running out of content to put up on the FMA Pulse YouTube. So that's when Florida came. I'm like, all right, it's time to get the ball rolling again.
Yep.
Start doing interviews in person. So that's pretty much what I've been doing since spring of 2021 now.
Wow. That's yeah. I mean, it's nice having the time and opportunity to like take care of things when we were locked down. Because I mean, there was a lot during lockdown. I mean, people came out and spent some time on their previous hobbies, spent on things that they neglected, and it's nice to be able to catch up. But yeah, at some point we got to go do stuff again. So let's back up a little bit. For those tuning in, the majority of people who tune into this like at random podcast already come from a combat sports world. They come from a Filipino martial arts world. So typically they might know who I have on here, but for the sake of those who don't, would you like to explain who you are and what you bring to the FMA community aside from all the other awesome that you do?
Jesse Santiago with FMA Pulse, video producer. Been doing that consistently since 2017, but technically I started doing FMA Pulse 2010. I took a break afterwards for a little bit because I went to grad school.
Hmm.
Tried to do the whole 9 to 5 thing and hated it.
Yeah.
So what I bring to the FMA community, I'm just trying to bring an awareness to FMA as a whole, not just a specific system. I remember back in my teens, there was an Inside Kung Fu article about FMA back in like the late 90s.
Yeah.
And Professor Remy Presas, and it talked about the evolution art of Arnis. And I remember buying that magazine because I was like, oh, cool, I'm Filipino. There's something about Filipino in
Yeah.
some Inside Kung Fu magazine. So, and then never heard anything from it since.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until 2004 that I found out about Filipino martial arts in Chicago, which I started training in around that same time. But I ended up stopping after 3 months because, at one point I was training for MMA and I couldn't afford it.
Yeah. Training for MMA. That's we'll come back to that because that's an interesting subject as a Filipino martial arts practitioner and instructor. So, but yeah, go ahead. Sorry to.
So I had a 3 month intro during the summer of 2004. I really took to it, but I was really focused on training for MMA. Fast forward to 2006, I literally got burnt out training with all the injuries and all this stuff. And I was like straight out of college. I'm like, I'm broke. I can't afford this training anymore. And when am I going to start fighting for this Mayweather money? Which is not going to happen.
Nope.
And then a few college buddies of mine, we started our own video production company around that same time. And I was doing multiple things. So on top of that, I was after school instructor for video arts, running the business, and then trying to train for mixed martial arts. And then eventually just training started to falter. Started dating this girl at the time. And I was like, yeah. And then, focusing on videos and doing videos, and everything was going good until the crash of 2008 happened with the economy crashing, and had to fold up shop. Working on freelance projects here and there. And then around 2009, one of my buddies told me about FMA Pulse, and he's actually my co business partner, Mike Karubin. And he talking to me about hey, we're thinking about doing online lessons. Would you be interested in doing the video work? Because he knew I had experience doing video work. And I'm like, yeah. So we shot a few stuff. And at the time there was 3 of us. But the other guy left because he got a job in Seattle working for Boeing. So he left, and it was just Mike and me running things at the moment. And that was the same time I kind of started training FMA again, was in 2009. I met up with the same group that I met in 2004. And by that time I was just flat broke. Just with the economy, I had to close up shop, had to declare bankruptcy, all that stuff. And, I wanted to get back in the training. And, my instructor at the time, the late Maha Guru Defensor, he's like, you just train, we'll figure it out in exchange. So in exchange for me taking classes, I would do some video work for him until I can get some money to start paying for classes. So that started in 09. And it just snowballed from there, like until 2012, 2013, until I took another break for grad school. And within that time, I was training both Defensor method, and around 2013 is when I started training Balintawak. But another 2 or 3 year hiatus. Grad school, started dating another girl, and, and training pretty much went out the window. But once the relationship ended in 2016 and I graduated, that's when I started snowballing training again, focusing on Balintawak. And then after that, started leaning more towards Balintawak because I came from that old school garage training where it's like flavor of the day. You don't know what's the curriculum of that day. And I needed more structure. So I kind of leaned more towards Balintawak. But eventually, by the time it's weird, it was like in 2021 when I got my Guru level in Defensor method and I got my FQI in the same year. It just happened. But yeah, I mean, started doing FMA Pulse full time again 2017 when I officially left the education system around that time.
So that's cool. All right, I want to go back a few pieces. So your primary education background is in photo video journalism and education, or am I getting that completely wrong?
Yeah. So my bachelor's, I have a fine arts in film and video.
Okay.
And my master's is in education, youth development.
Okay. So, which leads to a very interesting topic that I run into within the FMA community, or just martial arts in general as instructors. Well, as instructors, we were very passionate at what we do. We're fun at varying levels of degree of excellence when it comes to our particular skill set and martial arts of choice. Because and time has really allowed us to carry through and spend that time developing our style and our skills and everything else. However, as business owners, as school owners, as educators, that gets kind of pushed off to the back. And what's interesting that I find is some of the really phenomenal martial arts instructors have a degree in business, have some sort of degree attached to education, and has some association with the behavioral health community. And what I'm finding is when we talk about codifying, there's like this whole the backyard training methodology. Because I mean, I started in the backyard with the men of my family, and it's funny, I'm back in the backyard with my son and again men of my family, and it's really interesting seeing like that approach of like, hey, we're going to do this today, but when it comes to schools, curriculum, and structure, you have to codify things, and it's a big point of contention that I've seen in the FMA community in general. It's like the agreement of what is what. But I mean, if we're looking at the fact that we want to pass this down the line, the one of the benefits that we have so far is we have video work, which has been an absolute bit of success for us as an FMA community, is because we have so much video and we spend so much time developing video and documenting stuff. And the other part where we can like do some better work, I think, is in the curriculum, um, annotation, documentation, and archiving. Now, the question we run into is the different camps of agreeing what a curriculum is, and I think it's like group upon group and organization on organization. But back to that long bird trail here, with an education background, with building curriculum, if you've done and built curriculum. Have you seen some successes and otherwise with that?
I mean, yeah, I've been fortunate enough to meet many other systems that have codified their system, but it was a long process.
Yeah.
It didn't happen until maybe the second or third generation.
Yep.
And from my perspective, when the first system with Defensor method of the first FMA art I was studying, it fell a victim to that too. The only reason why they finally finalized the curriculum is because the founder was dying, and
Yeah.
second in command, were trying to organize everything, and it was just like, why are you waiting until you're dying to get things structured and together? Um, to see the art grow and pass on, you do need a formalized structure. but I understand the culture of like, whatever happens happens.
Yeah.
That you should train for that too. But then again, it's like how many of us are actually training for the actual fight? So there's the sports combat, which actually works just fine.
Mhm.
And the art side of Filipino martial arts is just an expression of movement based on an instructor's interpretation of combat. Um, it's difficult because from what I've seen so far, there's many similarities across systems. It's just how they teach it and how they do things. Um, so yeah, I mean, I hope I answered that question. That's the best of
No,
my.
no, yeah, you got what I was trying to gear toward. Because like codifying is unique to, like you said, the particular system, but the things that we do codify, because like the things that we are constantly arguing about in the FMA community is spelling, for example. And anybody who comes from an educational background, especially with like focus on English, uh, is they'll understand like the nuances of different language structures may vary beyond the scope of just the tribal local expression. And
Yep.
so with that, there's going to be a bit of a dialect variety. And like the things that I run into is like within the FMA community. I mean, we have the FMA Phil-Am community in Western, which uses the terminology specific to whatever lineage, and then there's FMA back in the islands, where and there's a disconnect that I'm finding is like again going back to spelling is understanding that we have a wide variety of different languages that make up the overall ethnosphere of the Filipino martial arts, and those representative of it, but the arguments we run into is how do we codify the language, terminology, and do we have to or should we in the first place? Because like the idea of like a homogenous um, structure for education and terminology lends to like who is going to be in charge and what are we keeping and then what are we losing, and that's it's a funny thing. I don't think will ever actually get solved, but it's interesting to hear what people have to say about that, especially if they come from an education background.
Yeah, and the thing is, like within the Filipino culture itself, I mean, the national language is Tagalog, but then you
Hmm.
have Bisaya, you have Ilocano, you have Ilonggo, you have Chabacano, and so many other languages. I mean, you have 7,500 islands. You got to have different languages and different cultures within each island. So it's hard because like within like the Korean martial arts, they speak Korean. I'm
Yep.
sure there's subsets of dialects, but it's Korean, and it's the same thing with the
Mhm.
so they could all speak the same language, and they see things as a betterment of the whole, as opposed to just my tribe here, your tribe there. Like as a nation, we could benefit of the outsiders learning from us, and also learning the culture and language. And then once it became a sport, just like, oh, we could make money off of this too. So
Mhm. Well, it's interesting. So, like in my conversations with students and just people in general about when it comes to the Philippines and FMA and the different tribes, pre World War II, pre unification and independence. I mean, the Philippines itself is a large ethnosphere that I associate like the indigenous American nations here in the U.S. and
yep.
continental U.S. They are unified in the fact that they're indigenous America, but they're not the same tribe. Similar in peoples and structure and substrate, but they're still not the same people. And so when people generalize, that becomes a problem. And in the case with FMA, because Westerners and just people in general just generalize to make things easier and don't spend time on the specificity and the nuance. And this is where a lot of argument gets into play when like the critical thinking aspect of like, hey, let's pay attention to where this terminology came from, whose tribe, whose lineage, and the linguistic structure attached to it, and don't get too lost in the weeds. Because, like again, here in the U.S., we simplify things
Yeah.
and we remove nuances and cultural uniqueness, and it can be a good thing and it could be a bad thing. It's just it's very interesting when it comes to FMA in the West because I was raised here in the States, born in the Philippines, but I was raised typically in a white community with some attachment to like the Polynesian Samoan community. But like I came to FMA late in life as like officially FMA. It's really like within the FMA community with other Filipinos. So like the thing that I run into is again this idea of language attachment and specificity to style. And I wonder, have you had a similar situation? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, because I started FMA late as well. Like when I
yeah.
started focusing on it, I was 29. And I, like you, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago.
Hmm.
So my friends growing up were either of Latino descent,
Hmm.
Puerto Rican, Jewish, Greek, and I really didn't start hanging around like my undergrad years.
Yeah.
The Chinese, Laotians, and Thai, and when I was going to film school, but I really didn't get involved in the Filipino community until like my mid 20s.
Hmm.
And it was just because there was a Filipino community like within the other suburbs, but where I grew up, it was pretty much a mixed bag. I mean, I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in the burbs, so I could relate to that. But yeah, I mean, that longing for culture, I got that within the FMA community specifically. Um,
Hmm.
and I got to learn more because, like, in detail, like, I thought FMA was FMA, like, oh, it's just using sticks and blades. But I didn't know there was, oh, Piketty Tertia, there's modern Arnis, there's Balintawak, and there's all these other subset systems and even other systems within systems. So it just got deeper and deeper and within that aspect, because I think most people are familiar with the JKD and Osanto version of FMA, but not the other parts, like what you would see in Stockton, what you would see in the Philippines,
Hmm.
unless they dove into it. And kudos to Professor Remy Prestos for spreading the art, because like Modern Arnis, Spaghetti Tertia, let's see, another big name, Modern Arnis, Spaghetti Tertia, Inosanto. Those are usually the big three where most systems are stemming from globally.
Hmm. And you got Serrata mixed in there as well from the stock, yeah, from Stockton. Which I mean, what's interesting, I finally actually got introduced properly to Serrata here within the past year or so, and that world fascinates me because I mean, I grew up in Southern California anyways, and I knew about Stockton, I knew about Phil Am there, but I never actually spent any time training up there. But up here in Alaska, come to find out, my good friend Virgil Navarez moves here a couple of years ago and has now introduced me to the Sarada lineage and like the interesting nuances in the history of that. As to like when we look at FMA Phil Am, I mean you have West Coast and East Coast,
Yeah.
and Sarada is definitely West Coast. So
Oh yeah.
and just yeah, it's interesting and I like it. So
Yeah, because it's interesting when I saw Serrata ending up on the East Coast, especially when I was in
mhm,
Atlanta. Because if you think about the founder and the people that train underneath him, of how they branched out, because you have GM Ron Saturno, you have GM Carlito Bonjak, you also have the one of the other guys, Master Jimmy Takosa,
mhm,
you have Suru Mike and I, and all the other branches that learn under the late senior grandmaster Angel Cabalas, and see how that spread from Stockton to other parts of the country. Like for me, how I learned Serrata was through the Anayan branch because that's who
mm,
my learned it from. And then I see other people how they play it, and I'm like, it's not too off. We just have certain cadences and nuances, but it's still the same art. We just learned it differently, but the movements are there.
yeah. And which is really interesting. So, because you have traveled and filmed so many great practitioners and instructors out there, and you've done some filming abroad back in the Philippines, correct?
Yeah, I was at the Russian House in the Philippines event earlier in the year.
Okay. Did you get a chance to like film and interview local practitioners and instructors while you were there?
Yeah. So between Cebu, Boracay, and Bacolod, I was
Hmm.
able to do a lot of people. Well, at least the ones that were available there. I'm actually
Yeah.
working on them right now. I'm trying to get August's content ready before I head out to Puerto Rico. But yeah, I mean, it was really a treat to meet like all the different styles within those regions. Granted, if I stayed there longer, I could have gotten more, but
Oh
I
yeah.
got enough that it's going to keep me busy for a while. And before I left Chicago too, like I filmed a whole bunch before I left, and I'm like, all right, I could take a break for doing these interviews for a while, and just focus on getting this done. Especially like I've been meaning to get the stuff from the Philippines done, but because of the process of me moving from Chicago to Arizona, I'm like, I don't have time.
Yeah, that's totally fair. So that leads my question as to the differences between Phil-Am FMA versus FMA back how it's taught back in the islands. Um, I haven't had the opportunity to train back in the islands. I haven't been back to the Phil. I haven't been back since I left, and that was 30 plus years ago. My forward intention is to go back in 2025. But the things that I'm curious about is in your exposure and experience with filming such a variety of practitioners and instructors, what are some like the major differences that you're seeing between the way it's taught back home and home? Because I mean, there's a distinction, and I'm curious to see what the difference is from your viewpoint as a videographer and some similarities.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, differences is it's pretty much dirty. Like when you go to the Philippines, you're not really thinking about safety. You're thinking about control, but
Mhm.
accidents do happen. And the thing in the Philippines, you also have the elements against you. You have the heat. Um, you know, the certain smells of food and funk that kind of permeates the air. And people, there is no formalities sometimes unless it's an organized group. So I mean, on both sides of the coast between Philippines and America, there's similarities in terms of you still have those that teach it old school, like to a select few behind
Mhm.
closed doors, and then you have the organized groups that kind of teaches it to the masses. Um, and I think with Philippines, with what's going on with some of the organizations, especially what I've seen with what Alexander Pisarkin is doing with Russian House, he
Mhm.
wants it to be a camp where all these other systems are getting promoted, and not just one specific system. So they want to organize it for more tourists. So I think they have to cater it in a way where it's going to appeal to the masses, as opposed to like, let me see your hand, whack, and if you come back tomorrow, okay, that means you're serious. um,
Yeah.
so safety is always a concern. I think on both ends. It would have been interesting to see how training was back in the day when I hear the stories of like everyone was getting bruised and bloody in the backyards and putting dotted jaw on all their bruises, and they're training 4 to 6 hours a day. But I think times have changed now with like padded sticks,
Mhm.
uh, and trainer blades. Where back then they just put duct tape on their machetes and that was their training blade. So I
Yep.
mean, the training in the Philippines, it's mainly environmental,
Mhm.
um, and also culture. The culture is different too, because most Phil-Ams, there's a disconnect. Like like most of us, without growing up around the culture, we know the
Yeah.
food. Most of our friends growing up were non-Filipino, whereas in the Philippines, it's like the humor is different. If you're easily offended, it's not offensive to them. So,
Let
uh,
alone the if you don't have the accent, as soon as you speak, like, oh, you're one of them.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes. There's also the disconnect between it's a shame too because the whole term amboy, um,
Hmm.
that they think that you have money or you think that you're better than them. Uh, but I've been fortunate enough to meet people in the Philippines, that are open. I mean, the Filipino culture has always been open to everyone. Um, and then it's different when you meet second or third generation Filipinos on American soil, where it's they may or may not have that cultural upbringing. So
Yeah.
mushrooms are done. Mushrooms
My
are done.
son, my son is coming inside from glorious feats of manliness with the neighbors. So we've been, like I said, we've been bonding in the backyard, going back to the traditional ways of the men of the tribe playing in the backyard. So, and it's also summer in Alaska. So my son's been swinging swords with the neighbor kid for a while, to include, and also with me and my training partner Cooper. So yeah, having fun that way. So so dealing with the Phil Am or FMA Phil Am versus Phil Am, oh, it's FMA back in the islands. What I'm seeing is like The differences are in like you said, commercialization, because in the West, it's very focused on the infrastructure and commercialization for longevity versus the tribal mentality of we got to keep this as our own and keep it safe and secret as our own.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, and it's and this is one that's commonly brought up is the fact that there are so many non-Filipino practitioners outside the Philippines involved in FMA than there are like native born still living in the islands Filipinos practicing FMA. And that's really interesting. And I think there's some change going about, but it's coming back. And what I'm finding is like it's the generation that were dispersed and displaced that grew up in the West, grew up outside of the Philippines that have like found this Filipino pride and part of that attachment to the Filipino pride is attaching to our heritage and our traditional training. So we adopt FMA as like the thing is this is how we attach our cultural identity. And it's interesting that the generations of Phil-Am FMA practitioners are now going back to the Philippines and saying and reconnecting the roots. At least that's what I found with a few, and I know it's the case for me. So is that something you've had similar?
Uh, well, in terms of the with the Phil Ams, with the generations I've met within California, also specifically in the Bay Area, they
Hmm.
definitely more of a solid history, not just within FMA, but history in general.
Yeah.
Um, they want that history that was pre-colonial Spanish,
Yeah.
instead of being, this after colonialization, which in Philippines is what it is now, which is influenced by Spanish, American, and the Western culture. So a lot of them want that indigenous history,
Hmm.
and that's one of the key things as well. Um, uh, and so a lot of them, if they have time, they'll go back and learn the traditional dances, and food, uh, you know specifically also clothing based
Hmm.
on, because over once it reaches the states, they think, oh, it's all the same, but like no, you're probably wearing something that's from a different tribe that doesn't coincide where your family's from in the Philippines. um, so I've seen that, in terms of the culture, them yearning to learn the babayin,
Hmm.
the scripture, and even though they're not using it on a regular basis, they want to actually go out and learn it, at their local community centers, because that's a good thing about the Bay Area is like, they're still trying to maintain the culture. um, I heard a joke where it's like the Philippines, the Bay Area, um, they want to be more uh, uh, Filipino, like pre-colonial Filipinos and Filipinos in the Philippines, where it's like Philippines is westernized, whereas some of the Phil-Ams within Americas want that pre-colonial history, so they want to bind themselves to it.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I mean, even talking about like culture and clothing and decolonization, like the decolonizing your mindset, which is inherent to Phil-Am FMA, is like that reconnection to our roots. I mean, even like today, I'm wearing a T-shirt that represents FMA. I got the background that's got the script from the Messiah or the Igorot script and and motifs. I mean, there's always that cultural pride, but that cultural pride often gets kind of like misunderstood, or like the person who's exuberating, expressing that cultural pride misunderstands necessarily where it comes from, but in their excitements, they get things wrong. And what I'm finding is some of the more enlightened Filipinos that grew up back in the islands or have even connected and immigrated here to the US is that like um, help mentoring the lost, the displaced, and to the cultural nuances that they didn't even have the opportunity to grow up with because they just didn't. Because like in the case of like I don't speak Tagalog, I don't speak Visayan, my Spanish is okay-ish, but since moving from Cali, I mean, I don't speak Spanish fluently anymore. And even when I'm around other Filipinos, like my accent is not typical Filipino. I mean, this accent I use as a code switch that I've adopted because being in the military. But like when I'm around other Filipinos, mainly from like the Hawaiian background or like grew up in San Diego and Hawaii, that pigeon accent really comes out really heavily. but even that's still wrong technically because I don't have that linguistic structure of grew up with Tagalog versus like the yeah, I don't know. That's I'm
Yeah,
digressing there.
too, because besides certain areas of California where they have a Filipino community where they can still maintain some of their culture.
Hmm.
Um, it's not, it's like certain parts. There's Chinatown, there's Koreatown, where they maintain their culture and their language, and part of their identity. But
Yeah.
for me, along with like a lot of my relatives, they'll marry someone outside who's not Filipino, and then
Hmm.
they'll go to the suburbs, and then their kids will become more Americanized than they are Filipino. Granted,
Hmm.
like yeah, at family parties and we'll eat Filipino food, but it's pretty much an American culture.
Yeah.
So in terms of like speaking the language, they'll know the Tagalog terms for food, but then formulating a sentence or speaking it becomes Seafood City, Brian Rodriguez.
Hmm.
It becomes challenging for those who are not around and like soaked into the culture.
Yeah.
Uh,
Which I mean, it is just the nature of like taking Filipinos out of our home of birth, our place of birth, and but reconnecting it back in with FMA and with the connection of FMA. I think we're creating our own little subset culture, which is beautiful in of itself because it's very inclusive as to we branch out to everybody across the world because we all love FMA, and that's one of the things that I find really beautiful about this community. Even though I'm not very Filipino-ish, I'm kind of like whatever, as are many other Filipinos that grew up here in the States. They're kind of like whatever, we're our own thing. But as a subculture of FMA practitioners that are united underneath the love of FMA, I mean that right there is an interesting sense of community that transcends nation states and cultural boundaries. So and it's one of the things I find beautiful. And with doing video work like you've been doing, that helps like illustrate, even though there's a lot of differences between styles and lineages and preferences, it still shows the fact that there's a unification of love of what we do.
oh yeah, like Chris True like brought it up. FMA family.
Yeah.
Uh, it's gonna be like a Fast and the Furious Vin Diesel. It's all about the family, and you all have your tribes. Like some people don't want to mix their tribe with others because it's gonna water down, so and so beliefs. Um, but they all share the same common goal of like looking out for the family or the tribe.
Mhm.
Uh, and if that whole saying, like if someone invites you into their home, that means you're trusted.
Yep.
And if you do something bad, then yeah, you're gonna get kicked out of that home, or something bad's gonna happen to you. Uh, and that's across all Filipino martial arts groups I've met. Because in the end, granted, we all like training face to face, but you could only defend what you see that's coming at you. You can't defend someone who's coming behind you to shank you in the kidney. So,
Yeah.
and the thing is, it's like they just tell you be a good person, be a respectful person, because you never know, like if you're coming off cocky and arrogant. Um, I was talking to one of the GMs in the Philippines, and he's like, "Yeah, if you're coming off cocky, arrogant, or starting trouble, I'll just pay that homeless kid over there 200 pesos, and I just tell him one in the kidney, one in the armpit. That's it, and you're not gonna see it coming." So it's a thing. It's like the training is good, um, but the thing is, it's like the morality and ethics behind what you train and how you present yourself.
Agreed. And what's it's really interesting because like the Filipino martial arts community is really, really small, as in it is still small enough that we can actually like talk to each other physically and train with each other. And more so it's smaller because of the online digital space with podcasting and all the Zoom things that occurred during the lockdown. So like the community is small enough that we can exact change positively, and I think it's what's really unique about us comparatively to some of these more legacy Asiatic martial arts that had their growing phases 50 to 60 to 100 years ago, because the community itself is very different than like the Phil Am community or the FMA community who's trying to like edge out its space in the overall community of the public zeitgeist. So and there's some really great ambassadors out there and there's some others, but and I'm hoping with like conversations like this we're able to express our joy and love for all the other content creators out there, that they're sharing the things that we all communally love. And it's important because all this is being documented for history. So
Yeah. And that was the thing too with like the with FMA Pulse. Like we just wanted to document this for the future generations. So when we're long gone, this information should still be there.
yep.
And we've interviewed people that have already passed away since 2018 when I was in California.
Yep.
Grandmaster Gonzalez, Grandmaster Rene Latosa, uh, Manong Samboot. We were fortunate to get these interviews with them when they were still living, and this is like the only documentation we have of them, as opposed to just someone writing it down in a book and reading from it. And like you get to see them, you get to see their mannerisms, you get to see their personality, and then you also get to see their teaching style,
Mhm.
and that's just something that we're trying to do for the long term. For everyone within FMA, in terms of whether you're a big name or you're a small name, as long as you're doing something positive for the community, we'll put it out there.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that goes even to like the basis of just anything is be a good person, have good character, and reap the rewards of it. And that I'm finding that more and more as I've come back to the FMA community, especially online communities, that the interactions of, like, you can tell the people who are there to pick a fight, and then you got everybody else who's trying to like share in the love void and what we do. And I'm trying to be of the voice of like the legitimately happy expression of I support everybody because I love what I do. I love FMA, and I know everybody else loves FMA because we're part of the community. So being supportive is really important. And what I'm seeing is like I said, the content creation community of FMA is also even smaller, and it's a good thing because we are able to piggyback and learn from each other. And the fact that we're also trying to like work with each other, it helps us like self have accountability with amongst each other, and also help prop each other up and support each other. So I don't know if that's something you've experienced as well, or
Yeah, I mean, all the people I've met so far within the FMA community, at least the people that I've met, happened organically, and they pretty much extended their homes to me. Like, hey Jesse, if you're ever back here, I got an extra room, so you don't have to pay for that hotel space.
yeah,
Uh, and oh yeah, there it is. And
there is.
I always visit them every time I'm back in their area, and it's just like even though we don't talk much on social media, it's like we're just picking up where we left off. Is everyone has their own lives. Like everyone's
Yeah,
married, have kids, they have jobs, and like for me, I'm not gonna be like, hey, what are you doing right now? Answer me right now. What are you doing right now?
yeah.
I'll be like, hey, I'm gonna be in town in a couple of weeks. Are you free? And then we'll go from there. Uh, but yeah, I've been with the people I've met. They've been very hospitable in terms of every time I've interviewed them. So with me, I just let things happen organically. I don't
Mhm.
go chasing people too. Like, if there's a person that I want to interview and like our schedules can't match up, I'm like, it's like I got to go move on to the next one. So I'll catch you on the next time. So
I mean, the fact is, I mean, things just come around anyways, and they happen when they're supposed to happen. And when we try to force it, it sometimes comes off as disingenuous, especially as like somebody who has observed FMA content creation, or just content creation in general. Is you can tell people who are really trying to boost numbers, and versus people like, hey, you're somebody cool I want to talk to, so I'm just going to talk to you, and whatever is fine works out and it's great. So, and it's yeah, it's really interesting to see that. Like two things I really wanted to talk about today. I mean, we've talked a little bit about content creation. The other one is about the difference between FMA as it's taught here in the US and FMA as it's taught back in the Philippines, and that experience. But it leads to an interesting thing that you brought up about uh, using as tourism. So with like some of the Asiatic martial arts, so like with China, you can go to the Shaolin Temple, train there. Thailand, of course, you can go to all the Muay Thai academies and be a martial arts tourist. Japan does a whole bunch of martial arts tourism. Same with Korea. So like the big four, they have that, and they
yeah,
have the infrastructure there. For the Philippines, aside from like the cultural experience of we're going to go in the jungle, go on the beach, and go beat the crap out of each other with sticks and swords and knives, the what I'm curious about in your experience is what has been the aside from going back to the very traditional roots, what have been some of those other things that have really sparked people's interest with Filipino martial arts tourism back in the Philippines?
Uh, for me, I would say for me I would just say it's more community based.
Mhm.
They either love the instructor or they love the training group or both, and it just gives them time to see the Philippine culture,
Mhm.
what's being taught in the classroom in, let's say, Europe or United States, just to be entrenched in that culture. So in terms of like how the whole attracting tourists to train in the Philippines, it's good for the economy in the Philippines. It's good to bring awareness to the different arts, because there's so many different other arts besides what's in the mainstream right now
Yeah.
of what's considered FMA. Then I was like, these guys need recognition too, because I'm sure you've heard the stories of foreigners going to the Philippines, learning these underground systems, bringing it back to their home country, and then rebranding it or calling it something else and passing it off as their own and not giving anything back. Um,
I have a direct connection to that. That's a funny story to go into. So, well, we can digress on that a little bit later. But yeah, I have a direct connection to such a situation. But as for like, yeah, FMA tourism, which is really unique and interesting, is I mean, we're selling the people. We're selling not the people, or that's awful. We're selling the culture, the society, and the community there, which is a great opportunity. Because I mean, what I'm finding with Americans when they go do training camps wherever they're going, there's a specific focus and intent in mind as to like we're going to Thailand to go prep for a fight and fight well there in Thailand. For Japan, for some of the Japanese and Okinawan arts, it's specific to theirs. But when I'm finding with Americans, they really like having a goal-oriented product result as to what they're doing versus like immersing themselves into like enjoying the thing and doing a little bit of training attached to it. So it ends up being more like we're going on a vacation and doing a little bit of training versus like some of the combat sports tourism of like we're going to go train, we're going to go fight, and we're going to come back bloodied and bruised. Because that leads to my other question about coming to FMA late. I mean, you started off in combat sports, yes?
yeah. So, as a kid, when I was a kid, I did the YMCA karate class when I was young. I had two older brothers growing up, so I was, rough and tumble with them. And then I played full contact football in high school. So, just growing up with that, and like in my early 20s, that's when MMA was getting big, and I
Mhm.
started playing MMA. So my main focus was Chinese Sunda, which is like kickboxing,
Yep.
Jakiri concepts, combative Tai Chi concepts, and then also I did like 6 months of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and then like I was fresh out of college, and the stuff wasn't cheap back then,
Yeah.
and to the point where it's like, okay, yeah, I'm learning the basics. I mean, fundamentals. Uh, it's good in terms of the basic uh, gross motor functions of what your body should do in a fight situation without it being overly too complicated.
Mhm.
Uh, and then but the thing is, it's a wear and tear on your body when you're going hard all the time, and it
Yep.
comes to the point where it's like, am I doing this for the love of it, or is this a job? And it came to the point where it felt like it was a job because it's on top of the injuries, trying to watch your weight, trying to cut weight, um, trying to figure out like you're working a side job, trying to
Yeah.
pay for training. It just came to the point like it's like I'm doing a job that I don't like for something that I was once passionate for, and then I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
So
Having been a professional fighter and trained and coached professional fighters, that is a very hard life to live. And especially if you're owning a gym doing the same thing, that is an exceptionally hard life to live. So if we can find the way to enjoy the art side of it, and that's the thing I find about like with Filipino martial arts is and this is a comment that I have about like what is the big goal and all goal with FMA of how do we make it more applicable to the masses and palatable to the masses? Because for an American Western mindset, is that we have to have efficacy and efficiency. So combat sports is the end all product of we're going to get that Mayweather money.
yeah,
But with FMA, there is no Mayweather money. There just isn't.
no,
So, and that's where I'm fine with FMA. It's still very much, it can be the art side. And that's for people who see and who know, that's where they make FMA sustainable, and they can stick with it for the rest of their life, because the window of actually doing FMA as is intended is so much smaller, because if we're training FMA to like the raw core of like stick, swords, and knives, the training methodologies in the student base is really small because you cut your way through everybody.
Yeah.
So,
And to build off of that too, the combativeness of FMA. I mean, before it was known as FMA, it was just fighting with.
mhm,
And when it evolved to an art form, I've heard this a lot within old school grandmasters and gurus, that they hid the practicality within the art, because they want to see your demeanor first to make
mhm.
sure you're hot headed or you're not going to try and hurt somebody with this. And once they've developed that trust, I'm like, all right, we're breaking away from these drills, and these forms. So I'm going to show you what this is really meant for. Uh, and to this day, I kind of agree with that methodology, because we all had those weirdos in class that like, this guy shouldn't be here, or this guy's kind of not altogether upstairs. Uh,
Yeah,
and especially like, this is weapons fighting. It's not like we're teaching you to punch and kick where you can eat those shots. You know,
yeah.
this is like breaking bones and cutting someone. And if you're teaching that wrong person, you're liable for that person.
I mean, the buy-in, it's really interesting with mixed martial arts, because the buy-in is pretty easy because of the exposure, because the UFC and just a wide variety of combat sports that's been out there, because there's rule sets to keep it safe, and there's graduated ways to say, hey, this is the different levels of intensity that we can go to, and so it's an easier sell. For FMA, because there's weapons involved, that's hard. That's really hard to ask a Westerner. Is like, hey, so you guys spar? Yes. You spar with sticks, swords, and knives? Yes. Well, that's unless you're in that little niche of people who enjoy that, which if you are, you're an FMA practitioner. But for like the average American coming into a training space that FMA is predominant there, getting them to do the buy-in of like, hey, we're going to hit you with a stick, we're going to stab you with this training knife, and this is how we spar. That's a lot to ask, especially that the soccer mom coming in with little Johnny or Petunia.
Yeah. Especially if it goes the way of like Western fencing. The
Hmm.
way Olympic fencing right now is pretty much a watered down version of what the art actually is. So I think FMA is like, they don't want it to be to that point where it's like, okay, points, you gotta wear the mask, the vest, they want to maintain the purity of it, because the freedom is, it's like whatever comes out comes out. You don't want to get into an altercation and think about, oh, what
Hmm.
are the legalities, because I can't do this move because it'll get me in trouble even though I'm defending myself.
Hmm.
uh, but then the sport aspect, there's that self-restraint where you have to be like, okay, I could do it but I should not do it or else I'll get disqualified.
Yeah,
So what are you, the thing is like, what are you training for? That's
right.
basically, it's
The
like you,
why, yeah, the why matters.
yeah, like in boxing, it's like all those boxing gyms, people are like there to go work out and get a good sweat. But then again, there you have that one, there's one or two people like that ask, you want to spar? And like people will be like, nah, that's not my thing, nah. And so
No,
you're,
this is the yeah.
so you, yeah, I mean, you've probably seen that where it's like you get like this huge class of 20 people in, training, running around, jump rope, punching the bags and hitting the mitts, and they look good. But then as
Hmm.
the comes are like, all right, you want to, spar? People's like, nah, I'm not. That's not really my thing. So it's across all combat sports. They
Yeah.
like the health aspect of it, but not the actual. I'm not willing to get bruised up and get my nose broken because I have to go to work the next day and I can't go to work looking like this. So
Yeah, it's the whole like 1%, 10%, 80% structure. Because like unless it's a proper fight house where the intention and sustainability is going for the 10 and the 1% of we're producing combat sports athletes, but even then they're still there, the foundation is still built up by everybody else. But I mean, having the graduated different tiers of experience and reasons why also helps. But with FMA, it's interesting as to one, the experience of the FMA instructor themselves and what they bring to that class and their intent, and also have the integrity of saying, hey, I'm not everything underneath the sun, but here's my specialization and my preferences. Because I mean, there's just like anything else, you got charlatans and liars and everything else of trying to be everything for marketability. And I mean, that creates a problem in general. And so what with FMA, without like a competition structure, I really wonder, aside from like the community side of we know people because our community is really small, without a competition structure, how do we eliminate some of that obscurity and also lack of integrity within the FMA community? Not saying that everybody does, and not but there's in the in the hypothetical here for somebody who is being dishonest about FMA and their in the background. How do we do some quality control as a community?
I mean, usually, from what I've seen with people like that, that they usually just weed themselves out.
Yeah.
Because like the thing is, like when they do get challenged, it really doesn't show well when it comes to the eye of the public.
Mhm.
So I mean, in terms of the whole charlatans were like, they know everything in the book. Yeah, and I kind of think that the whole JKD philosophy kind of like permeated within the FMA, where it's like, oh, we can do everything, we can adapt this and that. Do you teach double stick? Yeah, we can. uh, the thing is, it's like with me as an instructor, like I told people, I could teach you based on what I know off the curriculum. I
Mhm.
can't be a fighter. People who could take a hit and keep on going. Like when I was sparring, I thought I hit this guy with my best shots. I'm like, holy shit, this guy's still coming after me. So I can't really, teach you to have that metal,
Yeah.
that spirit. And I tell people, I'm like, what are you doing this for? For me, I'm doing it as, part of my cultural heritage.
Mhm.
And for me, just, I enjoy the community and like getting in touch with my Filipino culture. But if you're not Filipino, I'm like, why are you going into this? Like, what is your intentions going into this? Like anything else.
Yeah.
Um, is it the community aspect, or just to hang out, or just just get some light training in just for having fun? And the thing is, like, are you? There's the three areas when I interviewed Bram Frank. He said
Mhm.
like the three areas like sports combat, combatives, and then the traditional. And
Yep.
what are your you could train all three, or one of the three, or two out of the three. And the things like I have to, I can't really speak about what's in your soul. You have to figure that out.
Yeah. And that's where the beauty of the why and the why we fight is so important for one, the understanding of the practitioner and also like the instructor going in. Because like there's some very niche areas that FMA does really well, but but sometimes gets over I don't want to say saturated, but like over attached to like the efficacy side of like the battle tested, used by special operations, etc. Where it's very typical, like that's a very specific group of people. But like the breadth and depth of FMA is so much more, and that's like the accepting the beauty of it, of the variety is really important. And again, going back to the fact of or tribal nation tribal groupings from a wide variety of different islands and tribal backgrounds. So we're going to have a wide variety of just different things that that each instructor likes to do or prefers to do. And it's not necessarily a matter of who's better and what's better. It's like, well, do you like it? Do you love it? And what does it do for you?
Yep. And like going back to the art versus practicality. I mean, if you look at any security cam footage within the United States, Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, a street fight looks the same in all those countries. There's nothing pretty about it. When you see an ambush happens, it's the same thing. So there's no art form to it. So it's universal. What separates the practicality from the art is how it's expressed. It's like dance. So that's how I explain things to people. I'm like, so what makes Filipino martial arts different? It's basically the how it's taught, how it's trained, how combative is expressed through movement and not through um, primordial instinct.
Yep.
Because anyone can pick up a chair and smash you with it. So
Violence is pretty universal. I mean, human violence got figured out a long time ago. I mean, as a people, we figured out the two F's a long time ago. So, I mean, not much has changed. Our biology hasn't changed much to change that second F. So, what's interesting about FMA and the way that it's taught is where it has that like the balance and boundary of it can go the way of obscurity um, within a generation, or it can be evolved to something beautiful and have its like prominence in the modern zeitgeist. And where I'm finding where that line is whether or not the FMA practitioners fight. Because going back to the combat sports side, FMA, I'm not saying FMA has some issues about testing, about pressure testing, and this idea of does it actually work? The problem being in going back to the buy-in situation of how do we really test the knife defense works? Well, we have enough data to prove that it works because you stick the pointing end in another person. But
Yeah.
for like testing the means of the combat application of the style, I mean, really it boils down to like, is the person who's within that style and framework, can they fight and apply the things particular to that style and preferences to that fight? But it's also constrained on rules. And what I'm finding with a lot of like the interesting little balance, that little window is the FMA practitioners who don't fight and the FMA practitioners who do. And I'm not just saying specifically fighting within FMA, because fighting takes a wide variety of different approaches. Because like the case of if you come from a combat sports background, like you wrestled, did jujitsu, did MMA, did boxing, all the typical combat sports, you have a proven background of experience of actually dealing with human struggle with the intention of getting hit in the face and other people hitting you in the face. With FMA, you unless you're doing like Dog Brothers or PCAF or WACAF, but I'm going to focus mainly Dog Brothers, is it's as close to the combat. It is the closest to some of that combat honesty of full contact. And um and this boils back to my questions with like, is it FMA? Is if we're doing full contact sparring or full contact competition, is it FMA or is it not? Is it just MMA with a stick, or is it FMA that's full contact? I mean, it's a weird little divide of I don't have a studio. I don't have a proper office. I'm doing this with a door right next to it. This is the joys of content creation. But anyways, so yeah, with that long diatribe about combat sports and FMA, and if it makes it FMA, what is your thoughts on that?
I mean, definitely like in terms of pressure testing. I mean, the thing is, it's always about how. I mean, we can't be doing like Rock'em Sock'em robots where there's no gear and like whoever gets that first headshot drops and like the fight only lasts 30 seconds. With what Dog Brothers are doing, it's like it takes a specific mindset to do that type of training because there's no money involved. It's just pride. And if you're into that whole fight club mentality to see what you want to do in terms of being a fighter, yeah, I mean that's pretty much your cup of tea because you just want to go with what works and the adrenal state. WD-40.
Yeah, my door.
uh, so yeah, I mean, what in an adrenal state where like both of you are amped up, and then you just bum rush each other and see what happens. I mean, of course, there's skill that's involved, but then at the end of the day, it's like there are people that like that, and people are like that they don't like that. Um, in terms of your average Joe Schmo just doing FMA without pressure testing, and then like you're just doing an art form for the art form. Uh, if you're not going for the primal way it's meant to be used, it's just like you should get your priorities checked. Because that's why I hated theory classes in college because it's all theory. Just don't talk it up. You got to back it up because there's always going to be someone out there that's not going to be compliant when you're doing a demo. When you call someone from the crowd, like, "Oh, let me show you this," and then that technique doesn't work. So, what do you do when that technique doesn't work? Yeah, that's the
The
thing.
biggest.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead. You're saying.
yeah, that's the thing. non-compliant training as opposed to compliant training. Like I said, different strokes for different folks. That's why I ask people like, what are you in this for? Um,
Yep.
so in terms of, if you want to train for hard contact, there's a group for that. If you want to train for the military, no, go for that. Because like even if you train in the military, you're not training to bash each other's skulls in, because then you have no more soldiers.
Nope.
So you do have to train, pressure test your training
Yep.
within basic training. Uh, but for those who are just doing it, just like art for dance, they just want to do it just for health and just movement. And I've seen a lot of FMA groups do that. They just want to do the art side of it. So, like I said, it's like what's the purpose with your training? Uh, if they're lying,
Yeah.
if they're martial arts and they're saying this is going to work in a fight, but yet they've never been in a fight. That's where it becomes problematic.
Yep.
They should know better, um, as opposed to just preaching what their teacher told them. So, and that's the thing. It's with me. It's like I've been through that spectrum, and it's not fun on both sides. When you're teaching practicality, your body's going to take a lot of contact, and your lifespan in terms of training and teaching just becomes shorter and shorter. So then, as you get older, you got to figure out how much longer can I do this, or how can I teach this differently. So
I totally agree. The why really matters, and the why is different for everybody. And even within the spectrum of the why, even within combat sports, not everybody's going to be that 1% who actually makes it pro. There's a whole bunch of journeyman boxers out there that did okay enough to go pro, but aren't the title fighters. And that same analogy can be equated to FMA. Not every FMA practitioner is going to be training in the Navy SEALs. Not every practitioner is going to be training fight choreography for a movie. But if we all love what we love, and that's fine. Just having that honesty and that integrity is really important. And I'm thinking with the way that social media has been, with like the amount of content creation that's been made within the Filipino martial arts community and all the documentation, and the fact that the community is really small, we're able, like you said, to weed it out and figure it out, because you can see how a person moves. You can't just rely upon a treatise that was written a couple hundred years ago. Here, with we have immediately can see the proof of their action. And on top of all that, I mean, pressure testing in just from hard sparring shows enough as to whether or not you can move and whether you can fight. Because again, fighting is universal, and the principles of fighting work no matter what. What changes is the tools and the rule sets. So regardless if you have a stick, sword, or knife, I mean, if you can't fight, you won't be able to use those anyways. So
yeah, it's like it's the whole fight or flight mentality.
yeah.
That's why, like, in terms of fighter, the ones that could, like, I mentioned this when I did that interview with Chris Drew. It's like that fighter, that undefeated fighter that suffers their first loss, and they're never the same because they keep on losing after that fight, all the fights
Yeah.
after. But the fighters that lose but come back winning, that's the fighter. So
Yeah. Yeah.
and you
I
can't
agree.
can't really put that into someone.
No, and that's again, that's that internal art.
Yep.
Okay, because martial arts, there's the wide variety of the external, but there's also the internal. The internal I'm finding is more important, and the internal isn't just the chi ball. It's the internal art is your integrity, your resiliency, all those the reasons why that makes you a fighter or a martial artist in general. And the fact is, I mean, you learn from your losses, because like when I fought, I lost a lot because I fought in the wrong weight division. So, but I was too stubborn or too stupid to change weight divisions and weight brackets, because I had it in me that I want to fight heavyweight, but I'm 5'6", and that's stupid. So, but so with it, I lost a lot. I lost the majority of my last pro fight. I lost. So I mean, that's just the name of the game. But it doesn't define who I am anymore. We used to, but at the point being where I'm at, where I'm looking at FMA is more of an internal art, as to again cultural identification, connection, and just enjoyment of the beauty of movement. That's what FMA is necessary for me, and it is okay for people to like have that spectrum of combat application in the beginning because they may need to, but all the fun stuff, all the like the beautiful stuff happens in the long run. But you have to get there and and get to that point where you enjoy the art side because the art is sustainable. Being a fighter is not. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Would have been interesting too to see these young GMs, I mean these GMs, these older GMs back in their younger days, because I mean I've heard the stories of how they fought, and it's not how they present the art now.
Yeah.
So
And you
I
yeah.
mean, the seminar's over, and when I hear them talking, they're like, "Oh, remember that one time I bum rushed this guy? Then you guys flanked his friends and just bashed their heads in." I'm just like, "Dang!" It was like,
Yeah, that wasn't like we're gonna have a duel. That was just like this is straight warfare tactics. Attack at the flank. So yeah. And that's the other part about like the misnomer about martial arts and fighting and warfare and violence because they're different things. Because in the case of sport is codified by rules to keep things safe and for longevity. Now, there's some applications in sport fighting that applies to everything else because it's unified to human structures and needs and capabilities. But when it comes to violence and warfare and combat, there's other things involved. The notion of the romantic duel between two practitioners is a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding. Now it has occurred, obviously, but in like the scope of actual warfare and actual fighting, it's like, well, I'm going to flank him with my buddies. I'm going to ambush him. It's not like I see you, you see me, we're meeting on a bridge, and we're going to draw our swords and go that way. That's very rare, if ever. Not saying it hasn't happened, but in the scope of things, it's probably not the case.
I mean, it's like that if if you're into history, like wars. When I watch documentaries, war has like always been fascinating to me. How it's evolved from your army meets my army on the open field, and
Hmm.
we does the better tactics, to it evolving to trench warfare,
Hmm.
for it to evolve into jungle warfare, to
Hmm.
desert warfare, and to now urban warfare.
Hmm.
It's constantly changing because you don't know how the enemy fights, because
No.
it's environmental. Like you're going to another country, you're not familiar with the terrain. They know how to use their terrain against you,
Yep.
um, and so that's the thing. It's like within, if you tie that back to the Philippines, it's jungle warfare. They're not going to
Yep.
fight you. You are bigger and stronger. They're going to find ways to get around it, and it's how the Vietnamese did. What the Vietnamese did in America is like the
Hmm.
technology and weaponry. United States was superior, but you're on our home turf. Like we know where to go and what to do.
If you fight hard, you're probably going to lose. And this is, I get in trouble with certain statements. Like a statement I constantly make is fighting fair is a fallacy
Hmm.
because, I mean, it's a fair fight. That means there's rules. When it comes to warfare, aside from rules of engagement, but when it comes to warfare, actual warfare, it is overwhelming fire superiority wins the day. Overwhelming logistics wins the day. I say this because when I was training soldiers, when I was in the army, because I was a combatives instructor, I would also make the statement that if I used FMA in warfare, I'm already wrong.
Yeah.
And a lot of people get triggered in this idea of like, well, FMA is battle tested and we should use it in warfare. It's like, yes and no. But look at this in the very practical sense. If I am using FMA, let's say single knife in warfare, I'm already wrong because that means I am fighting as an individual, which I should never fight as an individual because John Wick is not a real thing. Um, I should not be fighting as an individual. I should have my buddy team, my fire team. I should be fighting with supported base of fire and overall combined forces. So, and I shouldn't be using a close range weapon in a point attack style warfare. So, again, this idea of fighting fair, that's it's interesting. It's like people don't make that further intuitive leap and have that critical thinking mindset of like, well, he says you should never use FMA in warfare. It's like I'm not saying people don't because they do, but me as the individual, as a soldier, teaching my soldiers that if you're using this specifically in warfare, unless you're taking out a century, you're already wrong because one, where's your buddy? Where's
Yep.
your squad? And all these other things. But again, it's this issue of like people don't understand warfare. People don't understand soldiery. They see like the super badass guy, the plate carrier, who says like I train special forces operators. but doesn't actually train like the full scope of like the understanding of they don't fight alone. So I mean, yeah, it's a little rant, but it
Yeah.
gets me in trouble on occasion.
Well, it shouldn't, because one of the other instructors I interviewed, he said, asked him like, what's the difference between Philippines and America
Mhm.
in fight? And he says, in the Philippines, I can call my friends and we could get into a fight, with another guy quickly. So it all depends on who has the most friends that night or that day.
Mhm.
And he said it's not. And here in America, it's like, oh, I need help. We need to fight this dude. And like your friend is like, oh, I can't. It's gonna take me 2 hours to get to you. And I was like, the whole mentality is where in the Philippines, like who has the most friends, who's reliable, and
Yep.
they'll get your back no matter what. Once it comes to the States, we're like, I can't. I gotta take my kids to soccer practice right now. So it
I
changed
mean,
the culture.
yeah, yeah, the culture changes. Agreed. Sorry, I had a little disconnect there. Yeah, the cultural differences does inform like the approaches to it. Now, like some like the subcultures here in the U.S., like Stockton, Southern California, Hawaii, something more like down to fighting in the streets mentality, especially if they're still locked into the early 90s, early 2000s. Then there's
Yeah,
that like call up the homies, here we go, let's go ride, because I've been a participant and recipient of that sort of lifestyle. But in the modern sense of today, 2023, approaching 40, that's not the case. So, and having that intellectual honesty with myself and also like whoever I come into contact with an FMA, like saying, hey, if I'm sharing an FMA with you, unless you came at me with a specific reason why, but if I'm sharing FMA to you, it's not because I'm trying to teach you how to fight. I'm sharing something because I love it. If I want to teach you how to fight, I have other stuff that we can do. We can go to combat sports. So
yeah.
yeah,
Because when you're dealing with weapons, it's the same thing without a weapon. You're
yeah.
gonna get you're gonna get cut, and that's the honest truth about it. Like even when sparring with like trainer blades, we're both getting cut. We're
Yeah.
just trying to mitigate the damage. Like I'm not eating this gash or this stab into my abdomen area. I'm like, oh, it's a scratch, as opposed to like this huge 4-inch blade going into me. So it's the same thing. Like that, I think the reality of it, like being honest, like
Yep.
if you've done sports combat, where you will get hit, you will
Mhm.
get um when you add weapons to the mix, you will get hit, you will get so that's the reality. I think that needs to be put within FMA, because when they say do this move and you should disarm them, or do this move and you won't get cut, that's not 100% guaranteed.
No, I
Oh,
mean, yeah, it nothing's 100%. And the fact of the matter is, this is why I like going back to fencing, because Cooper and I, my training partner and I, we do a wide variety of violence and nonsense in the yard, as evident by my content. One of the things I keep going back to is playing with German longswords and with sabers. And the things that I'm appreciating, like trying to figure out, is it FMA or is it not, is it's still fighting and trying to figure out like the things that happen more often than not. Mutual death happens more often than not, or mutual catastrophic injury turning to delayed death happens more often than not. This idea that I'm going to be a masterful warrior who can take on tens of thousands of people and come out unscathed, not the reality. Even with high levels of skill. Now, one could argue that, like, well, you're just not that good, which, I mean, that's fair. But, like, in the case of people who've been doing a thing long enough, they can still get hit. They can still get tagged, whether it's boxing, jujitsu, or saber fighting in the yard. You can still get tagged, and that reality is still there that you're not superhuman. So, and having that honesty with yourself and your training partners, and also those attached to you, is really important. And
like even in the video games, they got it. You got your double KOs at the fighting games, so
yep,
anything can happen. And that's the thing. It's the question is, it's again with any martial art, like why are you doing this? Because we're
yep,
in 2023. We're in modern society, and we're not fighting for survival.
no,
Um, we're thinking about making that dollar to pay rent, and so as opposed to like, oh, this guy is trying to invade my house, or invade my village to take my livestock.
mhm.
So right now it's just like, shoot, my next hunt is like, what's my next gig, or whatever it is to make that money.
And that's the thing where like I try to be more attentive and aware as to like how I preface things with verbal qualifiers as to like the subject matter of If I'm using FMA in warfare, I'm wrong. It's like, well, there's that. But like this other aspect of if I'm using for FMA, if I'm using this for combat, I'm wrong. But it's like the specificity as to, I'm not saying that people don't, because like some of the things that get me in trouble is like saying that knife on knife duels don't happen. Like, well, they do. Clearly, they do all over the world. But as an average practitioner here in the West, in suburban America, and if, especially if I'm a FMA practitioner going down to the local martial arts academy, that already puts me at an economic level that I probably will not engage in that level of violence. Not saying that it won't happen, but the higher means of it probably won't happen is more common than other. And this is where, like, again, having that honesty of like, who am I actually catering to and teaching, and what is the reality of their situation given their location and economic structure?
Yeah.
Because I mean, the difference is again like street violence that happens in a very specific economic cultural uh, sector versus like the average martial arts practitioner who is going to the training gym to train.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because if you think of industrialized countries, I mean, let's take, for example, England, where they have the strictest gun laws where no one can have a gun, but they
And
have the,
knives.
yeah, but the highest knife attacks in terms of, crime with a weapon. And the thing is, it's like, okay, what's causing these knife attacks?
Hmm.
Situation that's causing these people to attack you with a blade. So if somebody wants to do physical harm to you in a main physical, like in a major way, they'll do it, because even if you get rid of the knives, they'll pick up a baseball bat. If you get rid of the baseball, they'll pick up a chair. It's like if they want to do major damage to you, not just with their fists, anything around them will be a weapon, or they can make a makeshift tool into a weapon. It's
Hmm.
just this nature at that point.
Yeah, the creativity behind violence is often like the balance of morality. That's a big superfluous statement, but the fact is, uh, a, a lot of people don't think in such the criminally creative ways because they're not criminals if they aren't. So like they don't have the mindset of what can I use opportunistically or what am I using intentionally that is innocuous but for violent means. There's always that people don't think about that way because it's not their scope of reality. Now, as practitioners trying to understand like this idea of defense against these things, well, you also have to have that creativity to look into that darkness, so to speak, to understand what the reality is of what you're trying to deal with versus the theory of what you're trying to deal with. Because again, as you just put it, take away all the other means, violence still wins out. People who are violent and criminal will still do criminally violent things.
Exactly.
So, and and what is interesting within the FMA community, because there seems to be like a shift as to like you have the very tradition, like still trying to stay traditional within the legacy lineages, and then you have like this the hybrid combatives community, and of course you got the paramilitary community, but like the self defense community that involved with edged weapons. That's an interesting space to operate in because there's again there's a wide variety of opportunity there, but also a wide variety of experiences and levels of honesty.
Yeah.
And with your travels, what are those things that you see that are common for those who are successful and versus those who aren't within that scope of reality?
Yeah. And also, like, depending on the instructor too. I mean, coming from an education background,
Hmm.
uh, this was a discussion that kind of enlightened me at the time, where it's not the subject matter um, that's being taught; it's the connection between the student and teacher.
Yep.
So if the student can't connect with the teacher, why are they going to learn from you? But
Hmm.
for those instructors that are popular, there's something about them that resonates within the students, and usually, you know, within the context of the instructor being really good at what they do, whether they're good at like, fighting or not. I mean, if they're good at explaining a certain trade, or teaching a certain trade, it's them. It's not really the art that they're showing, but if they're going, WWE, like, oh, I'm gonna smash your head, brother. This is what you need to do, and all this, I'm gonna throw you off the turnbuckle, all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's the individual. Maybe it's marketing. Their
Yeah.
it all depends on the personas and how you click with people. And honestly, for me, I'm just straight up with people with what I do. I'm not putting up a front. I'm not trying to come up with an alter ego, you know,
Yeah,
views. I'm like, this is me, take it or leave it. So
yeah, and it's really nice to see like people who are genuine and not a character. Because typical with going back to the 90s, going back to the black belt magazines, because I have a box full of them from the 90s and early 2000s, like you can definitely tell there's some characters in there. And what I'm finding with like even with the digital online space of content creation, there's some characters out there. And what's really interesting is being able to interact with these characters and actually figuring out when they drop character, or if it was actually a character in the first place and they're just genuine and unique. And when I find those, I mean, if they're for entertainment, there's that special niche. But for people who are like genuine, just trying to share content and share their approach and method, those are the really interesting people that I find as like in talking to them as to figuring out the reasons why they do what they do. Because if you're doing for entertainment, it's pretty clear what you do and the reasons why.
yeah,
So
I mean, and that's the thing. It's with FMA Pulse, we're more in it for education and informative purposes. We're not there to entertain much. Like people tells me like they keep telling me like, yeah, I need to be in the videos more. So like I did the vlogs here and there, but I'm
yeah,
like focus should be on the instructor. But no, people like it's like, oh, you should be more of an influencer, but I don't really see myself as an influencer. Like I'm more of the producer. The
mhm,
focus should be on the subject matter. Um, the way I've structured the YouTube channel is more like a DVD. It's like the vlogs are the bonus material if I have time to create some videos behind the scenes. But in terms of focusing on the instructor, knowing the history behind what they do, the history of the style, and then seeing how they teach. And if that resonates something within you, then I usually put their contact information in the description box, and you can contact them directly. And
yeah.
then I tell people too, if you want to train with me, it's up to you if you want to train with me. It's this is what I do. Like I could teach you a system, but I can't teach you to be a fighter. I just have a good bunch of people I like to meet up and train and hang out with, and that's pretty much it.
I mean, what you guys provide is an incredible service that's got a long standing of success. Because the fact that uh, your catalog goes so far back, even to when your guys had that written article structure. Because I mean, trying to find your guys' old website and like some of the stuff that came from like the past, like FMA Forum or the FMA Informative. You remember that back in the day?
Oh yeah,
I mean, I miss those publications like I miss my Black Belt magazine because there was that nostalgia attached to like I can physically hold this thing and see this periodical come out. And like what with you guys, you've been there from the beginning all the way forward, and you guys actually have laid down the groundwork for a lot of other people out there to borrow your guys' approach, but still give a different spin on it. And it's really unique and interesting. When finding what pays in dividends is like the body work you guys have been doing all this time, is that now people want to figure out who are the guys behind the camera and able to talk to you today. So
you know
it's yeah,
it's weird. Like I was mentioning to a couple of friends, like, man, this within this past year, I've been interviewed more times than ever. Like since starting June of last year, I've been on different podcasts. So I'm like, usually like for me as the content creator, I just want to be behind the scenes.
yeah,
Um, but more and more, I'm like, all right. I was on my friend's podcast in Chicago talking about how, what are the struggles of being artists in the field of our work,
hmm,
what we do, and like we did that like about a month ago. And then when I was in Florida, Chris Chu was like, "All right, let's do another conversation."
yeah,
So it's like it's weird. Like for me, I'm kind of like people have mentioned like my mannerisms have been like similar to Tuhan Radio Naldo FCS. It's like we're introverted, but it's just like we like doing what we do. So
yeah, yeah. 200 Ray has been an uncredited like influence for me, like looking at like FMA as something available on YouTube. I mean, going back to that video that Paulo did like way back in the day, it was one of the first things that I got to see what FMA could be in the largest scope of exposure to the community. Because we have yet to have an FMA hero as a star in a movie. We have yet to see an FMA story done specifically on the level of any of the Shaw Brothers level movies or TV shows, but having the body of content that's available online with like YouTube and the stuff you guys have been doing and others, I mean, that's a good place to start. And it's actually one of the things that we have beyond other martial arts, above other martial arts, is we have that body of content that's constantly evolving as methodologies and the technology evolves, and we get to see the documentation all the way through. And that's really unique and interesting about us as a community. And it's really exciting because which leads to my questions of what do you think is the future when it comes to FMA in the scope of things?
I mean, it's tough because there's a changing of the guard because the old school guys, they're like in their 60s, 70s. Um, and I've seen this within all FMA groups, that usually when the founder passes away, there's a splinter. Um,
Yep.
and I hate to say it, it's coming. I mean, we have a lot of the big names. They're in their 80s, 70s, and time is limited. And I have a
Yep.
feeling once they pass on, it's going to happen again. History is going to repeat itself. So unless they find a way to coexist and
Hmm.
build forward, um, it's just going to be, oh, I heard about this FMA system, uh,
Hmm.
that came from, for example, I've seen schools that teach FMA, and then when I see their system, I'm like, that's modern Arnis, or that's
Hmm.
or it's Spaghetti Tertia, but they're not giving credit to where they learned it from. So there's
Yep.
always rebranding, um, and I think that's going to continue to happen. But luckily, with the internet and information, and what we've been doing is documentation, people will
Hmm.
see based on the movements that you do that they know where you're coming from or where your instructor or lineage is from.
Yep.
Uh, because you could only rebrand so many times to the point where it's like, I've seen that already. You're not doing anything.
Yeah, the body only moves certain ways, so many ways, and then when it comes to like the combinations of preferences and stylistic flavor, so to speak, there is a wide variety of that, but I mean if it's got a distinct flavor to it, you can definitely tell what it is and where it came from.
Yeah.
And like that, having the videography helps prove that point because having some of the obscurity of say like some of the Chinese martial arts, there are so many Chinese martial arts things that have been rebranded and given a culturally specific name, but it's like, well, is it really or is it not? And and because they don't have the documentation, because they just didn't have it, it's left up to the interpretation and critical thinking skills of the person viewing it. Because like the thing that I run into with, and I'm constantly asking, is it FMA? Because like my way to FMA was one, it was appropriated by my adopted grandfather, and then I was introduced to FMA formally later as a teenager, having trained in different things, and then having connection made by a proper FMA instructor with lineage and history, and he put names to movements. But I really wonder how much of the stuff that I was doing before gets overlapped and overridden by the stuff that I was trying to put name and association to. So, and I propose that question to the wider variety of people of is it FMA if it's just fighting with a knife? Because the knife isn't unique to Philippines. So,
Yeah. And another person I interviewed, Jesse Kabuyadao, he's a PTK instructor, and I asked him that question. You
mm,
know, what makes Filipino martial arts, and he said, it's in the heart of a Filipino. It's like we can't really teach you what it's like to be us, to be put in a situation where when things go down, for us the ability to dodge, weave objects on instinct and come up with things on the fly, because
mhm,
sometimes people can't think creatively on the fly if plan A doesn't work. What's their plan B? What's their plan
yeah,
C? And Filipinos were to the core, we're passionate people. Sometimes we put passion before logic. um, and we're a bit crazy, so we'll
yeah,
caution.
yeah,
um, and you can't really teach that. I mean, it's part of our genetics, our cultural heritage, and you're the fighter, and it's the whole saying of bahala na, whatever
Mhm.
happened.
Yeah, and that's an answer that I don't think we'll ever get, and I don't think we ever really need to figure out that answer because the fact is the beauty of what is, um, because of what we love, what we do, that's beautiful enough. Because to say that it has to be FMA because here's the language structure attached to it, here's the cultural names associated with movements, and that's clearly FMA. There's so much more to that.
Yeah.
There's the people, the mindset, the beauty of the heritage, the lineage, and also the beauty of that culture of what the Filipinos do in general. Of just like take the stuff that is great, make it their own, put their own spin on it, and pass it on. Because that's essentially what's happening here in the West. Is the Filipino martial arts community is adopting certain practices and principles unique to being here, using what they like and making their own thing with it and putting it back out to the masses. And it's that constant like absorption based upon regionality and then expressing it out to the general public. And it's really cool to see and unique to the FMA and just the Filipino culture in general. So
Yep. I mean, it has to adapt to survive. Whether you take from the belting programs from the Japanese, Korean,
mm,
the way they do their belting process for people to feel like they've learned something or they've graduated.
mhm,
You know, some FMA instructors are against that. Some are against the certification, but how else can you go along? The Japanese figured it out with the Western crowd when bringing their art to the West. They're like, oh,
yep,
these are how the Americans, these are how the Westerners learn. I guess we have to make it more formalized and have some type of belting structure for them to feel like they've earned something. Where it was like back in Asia, it's like either you got it or you don't got it. So it's like either you know what you were doing or you didn't know what you were doing. Because even the Chinese, like same thing. The Chinese martial arts, they didn't have a sash system, but
mhm,
because once it became more popular in the West, they're like, okay, I think the Japanese had something going on with this whole belting thing.
yep,
So when it comes to business, it becomes, like, how far can you go? I mean, where's your integrity lie? And I'm like, all right, it's more like an after school program. You get to learn
yeah.
some. I guess I'm babysitting your kids, and they get a belt for it or whatever.
Yep. Yep. There's that approach, which is what's interesting. So, like in the process of codifying things, codifying for curriculum helps build legacy and lineage, but it also helps for it to have accountability for those participating and also for governmental agencies who are going to adopt it for official means. So, what it does is helps like give professional prominence is by that approach because the idea of going back to the backyard and saying, "Oh yeah, we're just learning how to fight in the backyard." How do we approach that from a professional standpoint and saying, "Hey, I just learned how to fight like the way I learned how to fight. How do I pass that on?" Because
Yeah,
that's where I see like some of the conflict, and I've ran into this conflict, is that well, you're just learning how to fight, but there's no name attached to it. There's no credentialing.
yeah,
Versus like, oh, we're going to a school. There's a whole bunch of credentialing, but the fighting is okay. So, and it's a weird structure because like going back to in my time in the military, training soldiers, we had a very structured curriculum because it had to be repeatable, even though to a degree it was watered down because I mean we're teaching basic soldiers how to do basic combat techniques in as they need to, not training them to become samurai. We're going to spend their entire life honing every aspect of it. So like trying to find that balance in between is I mean, it depends upon the instructor and depends upon the means of like the organization. But how far down the line does the commercialized codified structure no longer look like the source? And it's such a weird like situation that we run into. And again, going back to the video work helps prove the process.
yeah.
So,
And it's the old ways of the instructors. Like I've been told this, where a lot of them didn't have an education background, so they couldn't articulate certain things. So
yep.
it was old. If you ask them a question, they would just respond. Then you do this.
Now
You know,
move this way. I hate
do
you to hear.
do this.
Yeah.
Then do that. Is this and that, and it's them reacting based on what you do at that moment, because you could do the same movement, but they might react a certain way because you were off, an inch of how you moved the previous time. So they're just good at reacting. Um,
Yep.
and the thing is like, wow, that wasn't the first technique you showed before. And they're like, well, you moved different the first time around. And I get it, because they're hardwired to react and do, as opposed to explaining it 45-degree angle, left leg back, inside sweep into
Yep.
a backhand slash to the abdomen, breaking it down in that aspect.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, the fact that we have the opportunity to codify things, I mean, we're talking in circles here, but the fact that we have the opportunity to do so is incredibly powerful and necessary for the future growth. And I really am curious to see what the next 10 years looks like with FMA coming into its prominence both online and in the public eye. And what are the things that we can do to like steer it into that direction that we can get the credit that is due to us as a martial arts community. Because for the combat sports world, mainly MMA, jujitsu sprung on everybody 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it's here to stay. FMA in certain circles has the opportunity to become obscure and lost because of how niche its efficacy is, particular to specific groups, and it can be obscure because of the lack of combat application and the higher um, proof of work, because there is no combat titles, so to speak, like boxing and combat sports. And I'd be really curious to see. Basically, what I want to see is combat sport competition for FMA at a graduated level of either you do the light stick sparring, stick tag, all the way up to Dog Brothers full contact. I would love to see a codified approach to a open FMA combat league. I would love to see that in the long run. I don't know if we ever will, but that'd be one way to prove stuff.
I mean, besides Dog Brothers, I have you seen Juego Toro, the
Yeah, yeah,
MMA with the with the
yep,
sticks? So I mean, I think it's going in the right direction. But there's always going to be that purist who like, oh, that guy ate like 3 stick shots to his helmet. He would have been down already. But like, yeah, we know.
yeah,
I mean, so you're not going to appease everyone. So in terms of, again, what are you doing this for? I mean, if you want to go for sport aspect, but then again, why are you doing it? Like, are you planning on doing this for financial purposes?
yeah,
Um, and FMA is always going to be that weird martial art in the corner of a gym or a dojo, and people are like, what's that? It's Arnis, Eskrima. What's that? It's the
yeah,
Philippines. What's the Philippines? Is that in Mexico? Like, I've had that come to me
yep,
times. Like,
yep.
people
Oh, it's
still.
like what? Yeah, people think that you come up to you and think you're Mexican. It's like, yeah, nope, nope, wrong kind of brown, homie. Yeah. But the thing though is like with FMA, because of the prominence of what again the work that's been done here in the past 10, 15 years is people who know, and especially like combat sports gyms, like if it's especially if it's an old school proper fight house, they have a general eye of okay, that's FMA. I've seen this before because we just have, and it's finding those little niche gyms that is actually a proper combat gym, proper fight house, fight club. They know what's up. And it's like trying to sell it off to like the masses of understanding like that's the 80% belt factory group. The representation of FMA gets a little skewed. But the people who actually fights those fight gyms, they see it and they know and they recognize it. Even though they may not have the appropriate name, they know what it is. And it's really interesting to see that. Because like going having worked in combat sports for so long as I did, and also in professional martial arts and traditional martial arts, there was a real difference between like the way that some of the Asian martial arts communities viewed FMA as like, oh, it's just a supplemental thing, or is this that thing that people do at seminars? It's like you people with sticks, versus the combat sports world is like, oh, you guys fight with knives, you guys fight with sticks, but it's still that umbrella of hey, you're the guys who also fight. So it's just trying to figure out like who you're talking to is also really important. So
Yeah, and I think going forward, historical context needs to be ironed out.
yep,
Um, and the thing is, like, like again, there's that challenge between Phil-Ams and Filipinos in the Philippines, where there's folklore stories that's being passed on here, like it's actual fact, but
Yeah.
it's fairy tales. Um, and also in terms of just letting the instructors be honest in
Yeah.
terms of who their instructor was, purpose of why they learned it, why are they
Mhm.
teaching, um, and if they can go back to the lineage of the area of the Philippines where the fighting style is coming from, good, because that'll be a starting point for people to learn. Because as things come here to the States, it's going to get diluted through every generation.
Yep. Because I would love to figure out actually where my family's lineage of FMA actually came from. So, quick story. I've told this several times to different people, but my when I come by way of FMA, I come by the way of my adoptive family lineage. So I was adopted in the Philippines in the 80s. My adoptive parents are white and were stationed there at Clark Air Base. Now, all my martial arts and military lineage comes through that family. Lots of martial arts, a lot of military there. But what is interesting and unique to that when it comes to FMA in particular to me is my grandfather from this adoptive family was a World War II Marine Raider, saw a campaign all the way through Guadalcanal, all the way to Okinawa, to Iwo Jima, to Burma, and came back. Somewhere he picked up at a single edged weapons methodology, stripped out any sort of cultural names and nuances, but brought back a single knife methodology of fighting and a single stick methodology of fighting, taught it to my father, my uncles, and later to me, but didn't associate the cultural names to it. So there's my family's lineage. Now, when I was playing with sticks, knives, and swords at a taekwondo school when I was 12, there was a modern arnis practitioner there, a black belt there, who was a Filipino who had immigrated to the U.S. Recognized what I was doing, saw the flat brown nose, and said like, "Oh, you're Filipino. I'm Filipino. You should know what you're doing." And it's like, "Oh yeah, you're doing FMA." I had no idea what I was doing. They had no idea there was a cultural art attached to the stuff that I was doing, and he put names and connections to it. But again, the thing I run into is I was already doing stuff up until that point outside of the scope of FMA. Because like my three other major lineages of martial arts is Western boxing, American spin off of Taekwondo, Kenpo, just American karate, and Shoy Li Foot Kung Fu. So I really wonder with how much my movement is informed based upon that versus some of the flair of the FMA I've adopted over the years. And it's the question of which came first, or which influences the other. So,
Because especially if you're coming from multiple methodologies, it's hard to pinpoint because you've already hardwired your body to do certain things. Like, only person that could say something is the person watching you, because when you're moving, you're not thinking about choily foot into this
yep,
triangle work, into this shuffle step. You just you're going things based on reaction. So
yep. And at this point in my life, I don't, to a point, yeah, I'm a lineage holder as to what my family does. But the fact is, I really try not to brand it necessarily as FMA. It's just, this is the way that we like to fight.
yeah,
Where I've adopted into is trying to buy into lineages that I'm training under is to like, hey, I'm going to go through the process of learn FMA through a formal process of instruction. Say like what I'm doing with Taboada Balintawak is I'm going through that dedicated process of like I'm training a FMA specific lineage with codified curriculum and infrastructure so I can have that connection to that lineage. But all the stuff in between, when it comes to like my own personal movement, that's my own. I don't have a name to it. It's just the way I move. And I find that there's a lot of other practitioners who are in the same boat. If they came to FMA late, is that that's just the way that they move. And it's unique and interesting.
I mean, also, like, are you teaching the cultural language and identities with the art? And that's the only thing that's going to separate it.
Yeah.
Like when you take taekwondo classes or any that type of Chinese or Japanese martial arts, you have to say yes sir, no sir,
Hmm.
and in their language, and then maybe try and read some type of calligraphy from their language, and then that's your cultural aspect of Korean, Japanese, or Chinese culture. And if you're not doing that with your teaching, just it's you're not presenting that culture within that training method.
And that's why I like the like say the Kempo or the Kaju Kempo community, where it's very much like Hawaii, SoCal flavor of martial art, but clearly developed in the U.S. but even the cultural names, I mean, it's such a blend of things. So
Yeah,
it's like the approach that I've taken with it. So it's
and
interesting.
thing like in order for things to move forward, either they especially within the Philippines, is it going to be in Tagalog or Bisaya or Cebuano? Like they need to figure out what terms they're going to use because it seems like none of them are budging in terms of terminologies based on
Yeah.
their dialect.
Change that N just slightly from Panantukan to Panuntukan. Suntukan. Yeah, that right there, talking about from like language and education, that stuff drives me nuts. Because like this idea of that understanding that there is going to be cultural differences because of language regionality, people don't make that critical thing, but that's an issue with education. Um, yeah, we've been at this for like almost 2 hours on the night of
Wow.
your birthday.
Thank
I could be rambling on furtherly in FMA nerdism, but I'm going to save that for another day. But I do appreciate you spending the evening with me on your birthday. And do you have anything that you want to part with or put out there for the community?
Yeah, I mean, after 21, it doesn't matter anymore. So, I mean, thank you for everyone that's been supporting the channel. Mabuhay, all the people in the Philippines that's been supporting us. Muchas gracias por all my amigos in Latin America. Muito obrigado for my amigos in Brazil. And merci beaucoup for my friends in France.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing all the new content that you have coming out to the pipeline, as I know the rest of the community is. Again, thank you for what you do and what your business partner does with FMA Pulse and what you've done for the community at large. Because without you guys, I mean, fair to say that there would not be such a breadth of documentation that there is now. So I applaud you and have the utmost respect for what you guys have done and continue to do and my gratitude for it. And my gratitude for again spending the evening with me.
Not a problem. Too bad we can't have a shot of whiskey right now.
Yeah, I have coffee somewhere around here. But I'm gonna drop you down, do our outro, and yeah, just stick around and hang out in the lobby, and I'll say goodnight to everybody.
Sounds
All
good.
right, 1 sec. All right, guys. Well, that was 2 hours of FMA Nerd Talk. There really wasn't any specific coherent structure, as is never, but that is just the way I do things on this podcast. But that's just, I'm getting better at it. But I want to say thank you for everybody for hanging out with us for 2 hours and listening to us nerd out because that's just what we do. Things coming up. I will be on here on Saturday doing a thing with the Fight House Talks podcast with our wonderful Krav Maga instructor. So that look out for that flyer. As for other stuff, I'm going down to West Coast Balintawak here in a couple of weeks. So if you want to see my sarcastic brownness with the rubber chicken, I'll be there. And also I'm going down to Water and Steel for the first time. Same situation. Want to come at me with a rubber chicken? That's where I'll be. So in the meantime, thanks everybody. Happy training and see you guys later. Thanks.